So who are you?
I'm Robert Forster, and I'm an old man now, and I was born in Corbridge, just at the bridge end, and my first home was at Houtley in Hexhamshire. It was a farm, but the house was too small for to have my mother and father and a noisy child, so they moved to Kingsgate Terrace in Hexham, somewhere around 1947.
So how old were you when you moved to Kingsgate Terrace, Robert?
Well, I can't remember. I think I would be 1 or 2. It doesn't matter, because my first memories were obviously of playing there and the street culture that we had. The feature, I think, at the time was the number of children. We were the bulge, with a B, a huge bulge. This is the returning soldiers from the World War, and being away from their wives and children, and then suddenly, bang, the place is full of kids. When I was in top class infants at the SEAL school, there were 48 in our class. You couldn't get another desk in. But there was no traffic, there were no cars, and there was a sand quarry at the end of Kingsgate Terrace, which was an abandoned sand quarry, which was the adventure playground you could dream of. And so we just played in the street, in the sandy, as we used to call it, on the seal later, a bit of football, that sort of thing, sledging, always good. But what I remember most is we sort of, holidays, weekends, we just left the house and we were at our own devices, and we used to roam, down the town. One occasion, we actually crossed the Tyne. Little kids, we actually walked across the Tyne. There was a gravel quarry, and there was some sand martins nesting in the bank, and we walked across to have a look at them. And what was up to here? What were we thinking about?
What job did your father do?
He came under my mother's influence. My mother was an ambitious lady, and after he left the army, she would have said something like, "Now, Bill, you can do better than be a woodman or a bus driver. You're going to be a teacher." And so he went to a training course at Rannoch Castle for a year. And he got a job at Shafter Trust School in Hayden Bridge, which was a really interesting school, by the way. The headmaster was Edward Waite, and he was innovative. He was a very powerful personality and free thinker, and he had quite a special school in the 1950s. My dad was one of his staff.
And tell me about Kingsgate Terrace. What sort of people lived in Kingsgate Terrace?
Quite a lot of married. It still is a starter house terrace, from what I can gather. The people who go there for their first homes, and it was the same then. Of course, there were established families. We knew everybody. In those days, everybody was related, and there definitely was a community feel. There was a street sweeper who was a little bit suspect, and he used to persuade us to ride on the barrow. There were 2 bins in the barrow, and he got very quickly told by the woman to stop doing that, and we were very quickly told to give him a berth, that sort of thing. Yeah.
And no cars?
No cars. The street was absolutely empty. At nights in winter, the street lights were on. We would play hide and seek, and the block was always under one of the street lamps. And of course you learned to hide in the shadows, you know, block 1, 2, 3. And we just went out in the street and played. And we didn't really play football in the street. We did that out on the seal, but sometimes we played cricket in the street. And it's unthinkable now, because Kingsgate Terrace is just a tunnel with a line of steel, car steel on one side, and another line of steel with end-to-end cars at the other. And the idea that we actually just played in that street with some of the traffic, by the way, was horses and cars, wood and that sort of stuff, coal. The first car, we didn't realise it belonged to Mr. Wood. He was a salesman. He worked at the garage up on Eastgate. And there's a scene in Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, where the birds were the nasties. And the first one just appears and sits in a tree. And Hitchcock was a good director, so we could see its menace. But we didn't really understand why. And this car was a harbinger. It was an occasional car, so we could still play, but it was the first, it was the forerunner, and I don't know what happened after that. We had my age group, the boat. We'd moved on after that, and perhaps didn't play in the street again, but Cars Hexham, I moved back here about 18 months ago, after living in the locality right in Mill Kilpit Hill, Rochester. And now I'm a resident. I can't believe how choked it is. It is wall-to-wall cars. I do wonder whether we're at peak car. We, the British, are at peak car. I find it depressing, to be honest. They are oppressive.
So, did you used to walk everywhere?
Yes, everywhere. My father got his first car when we moved to Slaley in 1957, and well, let us say that I know the road from Hexham to Slaley very well indeed. I would not know how many, even though my dad had a car, walked it many times. And when I became a teenager and would go to Whitley Chapel for dances on a Friday night, there were always good dances at Whitley Chapel. We would walk, and sometimes we'd walk back, a dozen of us, back to Slaley in the dark at 1 o'clock in the morning. It would have taken longer as a group to walk it than it did if we'd been single, because, you know, there was social, we were talking and fooling around a bit. We walked everywhere, yeah.
What sort of shops were in Hexham when you were living in Kingsgate Terrace?
Sweet shops. They were all over the place. But corner shops. If you think of Kingsgate Terrace, there was Mrs. Bowstead at the end. It's no longer a shop. At the end of Kingsgate Terrace. And yeah, we got our bread there, we got everything there. And then, I bet it wasn't 100 yards away, there was the Alders. And they did Eansgate and Spittle Terrace. And then you went a bit further down into Gilesgate and there was Turnbull's, and they would have done that. And that's how it was corner shop. You went into Hexham, where were we living? You see, I'm talking about the town centre, aren't you? You know, when you went into Hexham, of course, Rob's. And I can remember when it was in 2 bits, one with an entrance shop. There was a television shop of Rob's, off Priestpole, and then they were on both sides of 4th Street with the doors opposite each other. And then they amalgamated it massively at some stage, I'm going to say about 62 or 63, and had it all in one location. And it was an important part of Hexham, the Rob's. It was not just a food store, furniture, just about everything. And now it's no longer there. It's like Hexham, the mouth of Hexham has had about 6 teeth drawn out of it. It was an absolutely huge gap. I'm not sure how Hexham is going to adjust to that.
You say you went to the SEAL school. What was the SEAL school like?
Well, the discipline is a lot harder than it is now, and I'm not going to pretend we were angels either. But while the very first class in the SEAL school, in the infants class, was quite cuddly, Mrs. Jocelyn was very nice. After we left that class, we were into quite disciplined. We were a huge class, as I've said. We were the bulge, and they weren't quite sure how to handle us, because we filled the room, and of course we were kids and we'd be noisy. So discipline was important. There weren't any drumsticks, which was the favourite method of chastisement in the infant school. But when we went to the junior school, I felt them very often. You held out your hand and you go whack. Later, when I was at the grammar school, I got whacked a lot, but it was on the bottom and with a sandshore. I tell you right now, I prefer to be hit on the bottom of the sandshore than whacked across the fingers with a drumstick. I'm not making any observation about the teachers. That's just how it was at the time, and we were quite unruly. We probably needed pulling together.
And at home, Robert, did you have a telephone? There was no internet, obviously, no mobile phones.
No, there was absolutely none of that. First car in 1957, when my father moved to Slaley, I had to have a car. Television arrived about 1963. It was a Sobel. Magic. We were quite late. Other families had it before, and at Slaley there were a couple of houses where we would gather. One was Mrs. Hunter's. And Mrs. Hunter could, when 6-5 special was on, have 10 or a dozen kids in her front room. Oh, just sitting out 6-5 special. Used to sing the introduction, which is good. And telephone, there was one in the school, so my dad didn't bother. So if I wanted to use the phone, I had to plead to be able to allow the one in the school, which meant locking and unlocking it at the evening or the weekend. There were present in other households in the village. The farms had them. They were very useful to farms. Can you bring a tractor down to a neighbour? I'm going to do the hay or the corn this afternoon, and I'll need some help, that sort of thing. Yeah, otherwise you'd have had to have gone visiting. Very important, but not everyone in Slaley village had them. What other, well, there was a bus service. I can still tell you the times of the buses. 6:10 if you were going to get into Hexham on a Saturday. Last bus out at 10:30, which meant you didn't see the end of the film at the Forum. What a nuisance that was. If you got older and went to the Fandango in Backstreet, you catch the ride home. Because older kids had cars then, and you'd be very unlucky if you had to walk. Sometimes I did. See the sun coming up. By the time I got to Slaley, it was about an hour and a half. It was about an hour and a half. I didn't mind.
What films do you remember seeing at the Forum?
Very first one was when we went to, when we were at Kingsgate Terrace. Mrs. Elliott took us and her children. I had two brothers, and it was Robin Hood. And I walked into the the Forum, and there was this absolutely huge man in green crawling up a bank with arrows falling left, right and centre. Couldn't believe it. It was the scale, you know. He was not life-sized. It was about 20 or 30 feet tall. Couldn't get over it. Yeah, I still remember that.
And the Forum wouldn't be like the Forum is now. It would have been a much bigger cinema.
Absolutely. Three very demarcated areas. There was the pit, where you went through the bottom door, and you paid, let's say, sixpence to get in. And you were right next to the screen, and you lift your head up like that. And then there were the stalls, and the further back the better, because you didn't have to look up, and you probably had a wider perception of the screen as well. And then, I've forgotten what they called the upstairs bit. But you went upstairs, and there were two parts to that as well. There was the lower part and the upper part. So you actually had 4 price ranges within the cinema. And then right at the back, there were seats that were doubles. And this was for the courting couples. And there was the ushers would always walk up there and shine their torch. Now just be careful. Yeah.
And you mentioned something called the Fandango in Back Street. What was the Fandango?
It was a nightclub opened by Lenny and Molly Heppel, and it was a very important part of Hexham. They were an enterprising pair, and they converted. Don't ask me what it was originally, but I used to go on a Friday night. It wasn't. There were dancing classes there for older people as well, but on a Friday night, which I preferred, and it was always the best night, they would have a live jazz, and well, live music was pretty amazing, and I thought these people were pretty skilled, and there was a dance floor, and you could, if you wished, dance there, but upstairs there was they served tea and coffee, believe it or not, and bacon sandwiches, and you could buy a drink as well, but we were easily pleased, you know. I liked the Fandango. It was an important part of Hexham.
And where would it be now?
Well, it's been completely revamped. There's an Italian restaurant there, and there's a garden. The Fandango, the building, does not exist. It's gone. And there's a walkway you can walk through from Back Street onto where the library used to be, nearly onto Beaumont Street.
And what was the theatre there then? Was the theatre there?
Yeah, well, no, because you had the Forum and the Queen's Hall. They were both cinemas. And the Queen's Hall, what it had as well was a huge dance floor, and it was known as the floor of 1,000 springs, and it was quite grand. There were pillars, and it was nearly big enough for a football match, that dance hall floor. I think it's the library now, and it was for grown-ups, waltzes and foxtrots and that sort of stuff. There was, it got a bit rough on a Saturday night there, or was it a Sunday, when the boys from concert would come over and the boys from Hexham would meet them and they would engage. But the Queen's Hall, the other part of the Queen's Hall, where there is still a cinema. It was a cinema then, but it would have a similar system to the Forum, of at least 3 pay zones, and they would each show 2 films a week. There was in the Forum Hexham Dramatic Society. They were pretty busy, and they would stage periodic plays and pantomimes, and I caught a little bit of this. It was pretty good, and the quality of it was pretty good, but it was amateur. I can't remember the Queen's Hall staging stuff like that, but I might be wrong.
And what sort of things, as you were growing up, and perhaps when you went to the grammar school, what was your impression of the grammar school when you went there?
Oh, it was another world, because the teachers wore gowns and were quite formidable to an 11-year-old. Once again, the classrooms were crowded, but my first lesson was Latin. A mo, a mas, a mat. Julia Corneliam, a mat. Can you believe it? Can you believe it? What was it? I understand the function of Latin now, but it was just full of discipline. The grammar school was full of disciplines like that. But I think the big thing when I went there in '57 was we were the first co-educational year. And so they were, and the school was split. Boys, and it took a while for this to dissolve. There was the girls' side and the boys' side, and they hadn't had joint assemblies before, and we, the little 11-year-olds, were probably the first. I would have been among the first boys to have gone into a classroom on the girls' side in the next lesson, and this Latin teacher, Mr. Corbett, that I'm telling you about, he could not get over the fact that as he came through the classroom at, let's say, 9:30 that first Monday morning, that there were girls in the room. And so the girl who said Julia Cornelia Mamad was called Joan Campbell, and she sat right at the front, and he couldn't stop talking to her. It was a big thing. Even though we were part of it, we could still pick this up. The female side, the girls' side, was staffed by spinster teachers, and it took me a while to work out why. And of course, they were all women who would otherwise have married men killed in the First World War, and they were formidable. There was nothing soft about Miss Foreman or Miss Shortridge. Not at all.
And do you remember particular teachers that impressed you while you were at the high school?
Oh, without doubt. I wasn't the best one. I was a bit awkward, but you have bad ones. They were just not up to it, and we actually, although we preferred a teacher who could keep discipline, it made life a lot easier if the teacher could keep discipline, because you keep trying. If you were a bit like I was, and other boys as well, you kept exploring the boundaries. And I think we actually, one of the downsides of mixed education was that naughty boys like myself depressed the education levels for girls who were much more attentive. And I apologise. It's just the way it was, and I recognise that now. We probably were a handicap to some of the girls.
And what subjects did you take? What subjects interested you?
Well, I was good at English. It came very easily. And I still get a bit cross about this because I struggled with English language O-level, even though I've made my living through English. I'm considered quite good at English. And we used to, in the third form especially, have lessons in which we broke sentences up into subject, predicate and object and had to analyse them. It was an adverbial conjunction or clause of conjunction or garbage like that. No spontaneity whatsoever. We were not instilled with a love of words, a love of the English language. It was just a bit too rotey, a bit too mechanical, and I could and still do criticise the way we were taught English at the time.
Tell me a little bit about the sorts of things that your friends went on to do. Your friends who you had in Hexham or in Slaley. What did they remain local?
Well, I took part in a revolution. Not just the Beatles in 1963 and that sort of thing. It was much more profound. There was an education revolution, and basically, while university places, higher education places, have been as scarce as henteeths during the war, and before the war, of course. For my generation, kids who first went to grammar school in '57, there were university places were thrown at us like confetti, and we took part in higher education with A-levels that were actually so meagre that you got a blush. Nevertheless, we did take part in higher education, and it was good. I enjoyed my time. I'm really pleased I did it. But one of the repercussions, sociological repercussions of education in an established community like Hexham is that it dispersed it. And it was equally the case at Slaley, which I probably knew more intimately from 1957 to 65 as well. For girls especially, if you went to tertiary education, you were gone because you married. And that was the end. Bam, where is she? With boys, if you were any good at all, you took a career job and that was you gone as well. Very few came back to Hexham. In fact, I'm one of the few, and there aren't too many lads I went to the grammar school with who are in Hexham. The ones that I see and recognise and talk to, most who I went to school with were at the Seal School and Junior School. The grammar school was just the great dispersal.
Tell me, how important was the farming community to Hexham?
Much more then than it is now. Well, you had Tuesday market day, and you would know it was market day in Hexham because the farmer would be in at the mart buying and selling, and his wife would be shopping, and she would take home all the groceries, the week's groceries, very heavily laden, and you know, the two would come in together. It would be by car, and they would meet up together at the end of the day, but their days were entirely different.
So the mart was in a different place to where it is now?
There were two. There was the bottom mart, which is where the new part of Hexham Hospital is, the most western end of the new Hexham Hospital block. That was the bottom mart, and then there was the top mart, which is where Marks and Spencer's is now, and its car park. And well, one of the things that I really remember, and you'd think this was impossible now, was that you would regularly have herds of young cattle, quite excitable young cattle, moving through Hexham on the road, being driven to the market. Now, there were sort of two streams. One was Irish store cattle. These are young fat finishing cattle that had come over to the docks at Silloth, caught the train to Hexham, unloaded at Hexham station, and then driven up to the bottom mart, where they were sold to people who took them back to put to grass and finish and turn them into beef. At the top mart, if you had unsold cattle from one sale, they were held over until the next sale, and this would be on Fridays. And they would be driven out of the mart, onto Priest Popple, into the cattle market, up Escape and up onto Intake, which was a lairage then. A lairage is a field system. And so they would graze on these fields and then be bought into the mart to be sold the next day. So, if, for example, you were in a car that was, as I was quite often, driving into Hexham from Slaley early-ish in the morning to go to school, you might be met by a road full of tails, bullocks' tails, and drovers, and your road was blocked. You know, and if the person who was driving was in a hurry, you might learn a word or two that you didn't know before. So, but yes, the skill of the drovers was immense, because Hexham, the A69 ran through Hexham then. It was a busy thoroughfare, and these cattle they were not tame. they cascaded and clattered with their tails up, which is always a bad sign if you know stock. And of course there was manure everywhere as well, and they didn't always do what they told. They were mainly kept off the pavement, but basically people dropped back into shop doorways, and the cars stopped. They just stopped. They drew in and stopped. I have to say it wasn't unruly, but there was always, because the drovers were skilled, but there was always the chance of something going wrong.
So you say the A69 came through Hexham, and there wasn't the A69 as we know it now. What sort of traffic was there on the A69 coming through Hexham? Was it busy?
Lorries. Yes, it was. The bypass was opened in 1977, and I must have been on Battle Hill later that week. Well, it was just astonishingly quiet. Lovely, you know, but chop, you know. Once it had been full of noise, grinding gears, you know, the zebra crossings, stop, start, and then there was very little traffic at all. Of course, it's all built up again. But for a brief period, Hexham was extraordinarily quiet. Corbridge was worse, you know, because the A68 went through Corbridge, and the funnel was the bridge, single funnel. So you have the A69 coming in from both directions, and then the A68 going over the bridge as well, and up through to Stackshire. So Corbridge must have been massively relieved when the bridge across a Riding Mill that carried the A68 was put in. It must have had its brief period of relief from cars as well, because it's full of cars too, wall to wall now.
As you were growing up, Robert, what was your first job?
Kids at Slaley always worked at weekends, and until I started to play rugby when I was in the sixth form, we would find a farm and we would go there. And we weren't in the way, but we weren't especially productive, but we were learning. And by the time I left Slaley, I could milk cows. I did it on my own, got money for it. I worked in the quarry at Ladycross. I could go there any time I liked. I'd learned to chisel out stuff. We were always welcome in the hayfield. We were always welcome to stoop bales, and believe it or not, at one stage, when I was big enough and strong enough, I had a place on the Thresher gang at Healy Mill, which did about 4 farms. And I can remember Vida Ogle from Blackburn once standing at the bottom of our stairs at home. "Robert Forster, where are you? We need you." We're thrashing today because I was doing what teenage kids do, and I was trying to sleep in that day. There was quite a lot of money. Pound notes, 10-shilling notes that came our way, because we provided useful casual labour at peak times, and you had to have the skills to do it.
What did you spend your money on?
I'm going to be honest. Beer. Yeah. Yeah. All right.
And where was the pub or place you went to as a young person to drink beer?
Well, we liked the Globe. The Globe was full of grammar school kids. Believe it or not. And we got on well with the local lads. We played darts. We didn't play dominoes, but the old men who played dominoes didn't mind us at all. I don't know whether it was because we were refreshing in a way. We certainly weren't dominant. You know, we tried to fit in. And then we went to the Fandango, which was good.
And what opportunities do you think there were for women at that time?
Yeah, it was... Well, the education, what you've got to remember was that in those days, when I was at school, if you weren't at the grammar school, you left school at 15. It had been 14, not much earlier. And the girls at Slaley, who hadn't gone to grammar school, and that was almost all of them, they went to work in the shop. End of. They worked in shops, and then they got married, and that was the career path, if you like. Later, after the tertiary education bedded in, some would go to university. Teachers Training College was popular. But then they get married, and they're no longer part of our family. I don't think there would be many girls who sat in the class with us as we went through the grammar school, through the 7 years at the grammar school, who would end up with really serious jobs like being in charge of their own lab or their own department within a commercial firm. I think those days would come 10 to 15 years later. I've got 2 daughters, and they didn't have a problem that day. Their career opportunities just opened in front of them fine. But yeah, dare I say this, the women's place was in the home at that stage. Division of labour. It was division of labour. I always thought at the time, especially in the 50s, that the mother and father, mum and dad, had equally important roles, but they were completely different. Dad went out, came back with some money. Mother washed, looked after the kids, clipped their ears maybe, and used the money that Dad had provided to feed and clothe them. And there were always allotments. Every family in Hexham had an allotment, grew their own vegetables. Very important, this supplementation. My family had farming connections, so we were never short of eggs. Food rationing didn't stop until 55, I think, or 54 perhaps. It was easing all the time, but yeah, my generation knew the value of food and the skill with which our mothers prepared it, and appreciated the ability of our fathers to make sure it was on the table. Rabbits. Yeah, you learn to avoid a sharp bone. We ate a lot of rabbit.
What was Christmas like as you were growing up in Hexham?
Oh, very special. It was the one time in the year when you got the thing you wanted. I think now children get what they want whenever they say they want it. But, say I wanted a football. I wasn't going to get it till Christmas Day. And then went on the field and kicked it around with a lot of other boys with new balls as well. But the one I remember best was, it was quite astonishing. I don't know why, but every mother and father in Kingsgate Terrace in Hexham, somewhere around about 1950, bought their kid a cowboy outfit. The hat, the waistcoat, the checky shirt, the frills on the trousers, and a cap. And spontaneously, we all left our houses that morning, let's say about 10 o'clock, and marvelled at each other because we were all coming out of houses all in our new gear. Mine had sheriff's stars all the way down, top to bottom. And then we just ran around up and down the street going click, click, click. And parents came to the doors to watch us. It must have been something. It was spontaneous. There was no planning. There was a craze about 1957, Davy Crockett hats.
Just happened.
Yeah, it just happened. Well, this was coming out of the cinema, not television. Mm-hmm. There was a television in Kingsgate Terrace in 1953 at the Elliott's house, and half the street was in watching the coronation. There was kids running in and out saying, "Has she been crowned yet? Has she been crowned yet?" Yeah, and it was black and white, and it had bars across the screen, and it was about that size, let's say 12 inches, perhaps less, even 10, and you could hardly see it, but nevertheless, you know, it was important.
And at Christmas, what did you eat?
Oh, chicken. It was the one time in the year we had chicken. It was very special. It really was. Cockerel, always a cockerel. And it was probably bought live. I can remember them being hanging, my dad hanging them up on the clothesline and pulling the feathers off and disemboweling, and they went in the oven very early on Christmas Day, you know, because if they were to be ready for, let's say, 12 o'clock, they had to be in the oven for, I'm going to say, 7 or 8. Anyway, they were the first thing in. And it was fantastic stuff to eat, especially the breast. And there was cold chicken the next day, Boxing Day, and there might have been something the day after, you know, the bones pared down to just bare bones, and then it was boiled up into soup, so there was 4 meals. And you wouldn't see a chicken again for another year.
It's amazing.
Well, yes, it was a revolution.
Yeah.
You know, farming and the cheapness of things. You can buy a chicken wherever you want, whenever you want. Yeah.
Were you conscripted?
No, I was. I got out of that. I think conscription stopped in 1955, but I can remember. My dad, of course. There were lots of people who'd been in the army during the war, and you know, would sometimes come home, and there'd be an earnest youth talking to my dad about the army because they'd been drafted, and you know, what was it like, Mr. Forster? You know, what do I need to know? Sort of thing. And you'd see them back home on leave, Fusiliers with their red pom-pom on their caps regularly, and then it stopped, and we were lucky. Yeah.